I'm Sarah Wilson and you're listening to the Roots and All podcast. I'm here to help you get growing. Join me as I explore everything plant related both indoors and out and provide the information you need to create your perfect green environment. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the podcast. This week I'm speaking to Adrian of award-winning daffodil nursery Scamp's Daffodils. The beauty of daffodils is that they herald spring. They flower forth triumphant with little intervention and in inclement weather, and I reckon you can find at least one in the large canon of daffodil varieties to whet your appetite, even if you're fussy like me. So without further ado, here's Adrian to answer all your daffodil questions. Quite often I'm driving along and I will see daffodils along the roadside verges, and what I'm wondering is, are they native to the UK?
It's an interesting question, actually, because we often see the likes of the lobularis, which is the Pseudonarcissus English wild daffodil, and we also see varieties such as obvularis, the Welsh tenby. So the name would suggest that they are native to this country and that you're going to see them growing in the wild. And we do see them growing in the wild now, but purely because of the years that have gone by and the fact that they've naturalised in certain areas, particularly around castles and monasteries and historical places. So as far as where they came from, the original species daffodils, of which there's, depending on who you talk to, there's around 50 different varieties, up to a couple of hundred of the species forms. Of course, there's many more now. Those would have been found in places like Spain, Portugal, France, and also parts of Africa and Asia. Mm-hmm. Some of those slightly more susceptible to our weather than others, but generally speaking, they all do pretty well over here. Yeah, so how they got here, there's lots of different theories. You know, the Romans used to carry them, they believe, as medicinal purposes to treat the horrific wounds they had. I certainly wouldn't recommend that. It wasn't one of their best ideas. But yeah, so Romans and travellers, and of course the modern day botanist now brings them across, and you'll find them all over the world in a temperate climate.
So how long is the daffodil season?
That can depend on where you live, but if you're a bit careful, certainly in this country, in England, if you're careful about what you buy, you can extend the season to 6, maybe 7 months of the year. So as an example, for us down here in Cornwall, I will have varieties such as the Rhinebeld's Early Sensation and the Paper White and a few others that will start end of October, November, depending on the season, certainly before Christmas. And then you'll get later varieties such as the Narcissus poeticus recurvus or the double white poeticus, and those varieties will be flowering for us in May. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, you can stretch the season out to 6 to 7 months.
Actually, now you've mentioned it, I'm going to get you to explain what we should be doing with our paper whites indoors, because I know people love to have them, but they still are a bit of a mystery. Could you just very briefly touch on that, what we should do if we wanted to force the bulbs?
Forcing bulbs is something I generally don't do, but you can have a bit of fun trying it. Now, the paper white, it requires a warm summer in order to initiate the flowering. So first of all, that bulb needs to be warm, mm-hmm. and then it needs to be cooled, and you can put it into a dark area. Now, the dark area would just force the bulb to produce some shoots slightly towards the surface of the soil. Keep an eye on it. Once it starts to do that, bring it out and put it into the windowsill where it's got plenty of light. And you'll find the paper white will then start to grow and you should get flowers a little bit earlier. But the success on that, you know, it can be a little bit hit or miss, if you like. Occasionally it will work properly. Other times you'll just have to wait and it will eventually flower a bit later in the season for you.
Fine. So if you didn't want to force it, you would be talking about planting it in a pot and keeping it indoors until it flowered in its own time. Is that right?
Yes, but be careful on this because the artificial environment in the house, it can be sometimes too warm for a daffodil. Daffodils do need a little bit of the cold climate, and they also need the sunlight. So majority, I would say, no, don't try and force them in that respect. They should be growing outside. But the paper white, yes, the people do have great success, and they call it the Christmas flower for that reason. Of course, it's a lovely scent to have in the house.
So I was wondering as well, talking from a personal perspective, I've got really heavy clay soil and it's horrible. And I just chuck daffodils in and they seem perfectly happy, which seems to be a little bit in contrast with where they come from originally. I'm assuming they want warmer soils, better drained soils. Do they cope with all certain types of soils, or do some varieties work better in clay? Do some maybe not flourish in clay?
Clay is particularly a problem. Okay, the daffodil generally prefers a well-drained soil. However, it needs to be moisture retentive. So by that, I mean, we don't want it to dry out totally, but equally, if it gets waterlogged, it can induce things like basal rot, a soft base on the daffodil, and cause you loss of the bulb. Mm-hmm. So as far as clay goes, yes, they can be planted, but you need to be careful that it's not going to get waterlogged. So by that, you need to be digging a reasonable size hole. At the bottom of that hole, a little bit of grit. Mm-hmm. On top of that, some multi-purpose compost, and then plant your bulb. Now, the idea of this is that the water will drain through the gravel. Of course, gardener's grit is what you'll be looking for. So the base isn't actually sat in water. Mm-hmm. By doing that, you should find that come the summer months where it's dried out slightly, the roots should have gone down and taken, and the bulb should be protected. Clay is most definitely a problem with daffodils. Other soils, such as sandy soil, in contrast, again, they can do quite well with that. With sand, you need to be planting the bulb really quite deep. So by that, an average bulb, 4 to 6 inches deep, I would suggest planting it about 8 inches deep. This allows the root to go down further and find the goodness that it needs that the sand wouldn't have. And also make sure it's kept moist, because the sand will drain away very quickly. The roots will be left with no water, and any goodness that was in that area will also disappear. So perhaps feed as well would be a good idea in sandy areas. And is 4 to 6 inches deep a good rule of thumb for most of the varieties? Yeah. 3 to 4 times the depth of the bulb. So, for instance, a miniature bulb the size of your fingernail, if you plant that 6 inches deep, it's far too deep for the bulb. Mm-hmm. But a bigger bulb, equally, if you plant it too close to the surface, you'll find that it will split up. As it does grow, the foliage won't have the support that it would need, and the daffodil will start to fall over and droop. So 3 to 4 times the depth of the bulb is a good rule of thumb for you. And do they need full sun, or can any of them cope with shade? They don't necessarily need full sun, but they do need a little bit, partial sun. So full sunlight to partial sunlight is what I would say. There are a couple of points on this. The woodlands, for instance, where you get the canopy, generally speaking, the daffodil will be okay there. The reason being that the canopy of the woodland area will form slightly later. So woodland areas are fine. Coming out of woodland areas to sunnier aspects, if you were to plant daffodils along perhaps a south-facing wall, sometimes that can be a little bit too hot for them unless they've got the depth of the bulb. Daffodils do need a temperate climate. They do need it a bit cold first to initiate that flowering. And if they're too hot throughout that growing season, you'll find that the daffodil will come up, the bud will form, and then the bud can abort. So it ends up hollow and you lose your flower. Mm-hmm. So if that's happening, just try a slightly cooler aspect of the garden. But yes, daffodils do need the sunlight. They need the photosynthesis to work with the leaves. And as they die back, that goodness will go into the bulb ready for next year. So sunlight is important for them. And if we do have the instance where they come up and the flowers aren't appearing, sunlight's obviously one reason. Are there any other reasons they might come up blind? There's a number of reasons for that. Of course, the one we've just covered. Daffodils will multiply themselves by bulb multiplication. And many varieties you can leave down and this will happen over years and years and years and you can forget about them. But if you do find that they start to come up and you get fewer flowers each year and eventually they become totally blind, it could well be because of overcrowding with the bulb multiplication. So you need to split the daffodils. You need to lift them up, divide them gently just by pulling them apart and planting them back. When you plant them back, ensure that you plant them at the depth we just suggested, so 3 to 4 times the depth of the bulb, 6 to 8 inches deep, and plant them a couple of inches apart. And then the process should start again. You should start to get your flowers, and eventually they'll start to clump up, and you'll end up with more and more of a display with your daffodils. So overcrowding is one. You've also got, if you plant them too shallow, that can cause the daffodils to come up blind eventually. Mm-hmm. And so again, plant them a little bit deeper. Not enough nutrients in the ground can be another, although the daffodil doesn't need a huge amount. It will send its roots down and it'll find the nutrients. However, a little bit of high potash fertilizer, and I put emphasis on the high potash. Of course, you need nitrogen and other goodness in there, but not too much of it. Too much nitrogen can cause a soft bulb and too much leaf, whereas the potash encourages the flower, the fruit that we all want to see. So a high potash. Lastly, I guess if you cut the foliage back too early, or perhaps you fold the foliage and tie it, I've seen this done in the past to keep the garden looking tidy, the goodness won't go back into the bulb and you're going to lose the flower. You'll get leaves, but you'll lose the flower. Follow those rules and you should be okay with them.
So there's a couple of things that I probably want to go back to from that. When you say about the feeding with the high potash, when would you actually do that?
Well, feeding, I recommend you do that early spring, just as they're showing their tips. And then again, probably in the autumn, late autumn. Mm-hmm. And I would use a granular feed. And you can just scatter this down in the area and let the weather take it in and it slowly leach into the soil. Mm-hmm. Early spring, again, I would use a granular feed. There is an argument that you should use a liquid feed because that will get straight down into the soil and they'll take it up. But they're flowering for a good period, so a granular feed and the rain we do tend to get in this country, it will take the goodness into the soil and the bulbs will feed off of that. With perhaps the exception of pots. With a pot, you do want that feed to get straight in there. Most certainly a liquid feed, but again, a high potash feed, low nitrogen. Do that early spring as they're starting to show, and you could do that a couple of times through the season.
And are they all suitable to be grown in pots, or is it only certain types?
They will all grow in pots, and they will do well. However, there are certain rules we need to take into account. First of all, some of the Tazetta types, the Mediterranean region these would come from, they're beautiful scented flowers. They're very tall and they do produce a reasonable amount of foliage. So they're generally back of borders. Now, they will do okay in pots and they will do okay in tubs. However, they tend to take a lot of goodness out of the pot very, very quickly, as will most of the daffodils, and they produce a lot of foliage that can look a bit untidy in a pot. So some of the Tazettas, by all means, experiment, but they're not always as good in the pots. The other bulbs, yes, pop them in there and enjoy them. You can have some really fantastic displays. But because the daffodil needs a lot of goodness to take into the bulb through the flowering so that it's in the foliage for the following year, what we tend to find is that you plant a bulb in a pot, and the first year it's great, the second year it's okay, and the third year it should really go into the garden. The bulb will start to shrink down in size and not perform quite so well because it's a little bit too restricted and not getting quite the goodness that it should.
So in an ideal world, we'd probably use them for 1 year and then put them in the garden and get a new lot for the next year.
A lot of people like to do that. 1 year in the pot just to see what they've got, make sure it's performing well, and then they put it in the garden. And I think that's a very good idea.
So you mentioned that they bulk up at the bulb. Is that how they spread? If not, how else do you propagate them?
Yes, is the answer. That is how they spread. They spread through bulb multiplication, but they also spread through the seed. However, the seed can take a lot longer and it needs to be an ideal situation. So for most of us, it would be bulb multiplication that the daffodil will spread by.
Right.
So if you want to do that, give it a couple of years, maybe 3-4 years, lift the bulbs, divide them, and you can plant them back in different areas of the garden if you wish, and you will end up with more bulbs. If you're going to try it by seed, which is great fun, you can take the seed from behind the flower head as it dies back. I would suggest planting them in a seed tray in controlled conditions. In the garden and in the wild, it will happen. They will spread by seed, of course, but they need an area that's going to be undisturbed. And most of us in the gardens, we're raking around, planting other things. It's just not going to happen for us in the average garden. Seed, of course, is going to take a lot longer to flower as well. You're probably talking 4 to 5 years before you get a flower on that.
So people would like to naturalise them in lawns. So I'm assuming that, again, they are spreading via bulb multiplication rather than seeding. Is that correct?
Well, it is, yes. Most of the daffodils you can plant in grass, but you've got to remember the foliage must be allowed to die back. So therefore, in a grassy area, if you mow the grass, it's going to affect the leaves. You're not going to get that goodness. So you need to keep it long for a good period of time, probably about 6 weeks after the flower has died back, which generally takes you to about June time. I would make a suggestion that if you are planting in turf, if you're planting clumps, then you can mow around them. Whereas if they're scattered, then you've got a great swathe of grass. So plant them in little clumps. And also go for earlier varieties so that you're not, during the summer months, having to wait for this grass and the daffodils to die back. So we mentioned a few earlier, the lobularis and the obularis, the English wild daffodil and the Welsh tenbies. They're great. You've also got Brineville's early sensation. Tete-a-tete is a good one that the majority of us know we see growing. It grows very well and it does naturalise quite well.
So once they've finished flowering, should we be taking off the stalks or the flower heads?
Yes, you can do. You don't need to worry unduly. The way I grow the flowers, I've got 2,500 different varieties there spread over 15 acres, and I'm certainly not going to go out there and deadhead them all. However, the argument is that if you take the seed head off of the daffodil, the goodness that's there will go back into the bulb rather than the seed head. So, yes, it is a good idea to do that. The other reason I would suggest deadheading the daffodil is the aesthetics of it. Once that flower's gone and it's dying back, it's not a pretty sight on the end of that stalk. So get rid of it. Just leave the foliage there. Fine. So yes and no. Don't worry if you miss it, but yeah, get out there and take the seed out if you like.
And how do they behave in a border? Are they happy to come up through other plants? Are they happy that once they've gone over, their foliage might get covered by other plants?
Yeah, generally speaking, that's not too much of an issue. Of course, they've got to get the sunlight, so you don't want them somewhere where something's going to cast a shade across them totally. But the daffodil is a great survivor and it will push its way up. And as I said, they even do well in woodlands and those sort of areas. So no, plant them where you think you'll get a good display. And if you don't have a success there, don't be afraid to lift it and move it somewhere else.
Okay. And when would you do that? Just after flowering?
Well, you can do that either when they've died right back, so you could leave that market and leave it until to the end of June, that sort of time. However, there's not much of a problem to moving them in the green. Some people would say not to, and that's because of root damage. But if you dig them deep to move them out, plant them where you want to in the green, you'll find that they'll probably droop over and look a bit sorry for themselves for the first year, but the following year they should come back and they'll be absolutely fine.
And are they susceptible to any pests and diseases?
Yes, they are. Not a huge amount, but there are certain diseases that can get into the bulbs. You can get the mosaic virus and the basal rots. There's not a huge amount you can do about this in your garden. There's not any sprays and the like that you can generally buy other than commercially. Really, if you do get one of these viruses, you need to be lifting the bulbs and disposing of them. They can come for a number of reasons. They may well have arrived to you like that. They may well have picked up something in your garden. It can be just one of those things. It's all part of gardening. Some things work, some things don't. I would suggest if you order new bulbs, when you get them, just inspect them. Squeeze them firmly. Have a look at the base to make sure there's not any white mould, and also look at the neck to make sure that that's looking healthy. If there is a problem, just whoever your supplier is, mention it to them. It's something that does creep in occasionally, despite whatever you do to stop it. But on the whole, it's not a major problem. And daffodils, if you want something to plant in the garden, they're a good bet. You'll be okay with it. They do get a few pests. The narcissus fly is a pest that can get down there and the larvae feed off of the bulb. Again, not a great deal you can do about that. Just keep the weed down in that area. But as far as pollinators go, a lot of the modern daffodils don't have quite as much pollen as perhaps some of the species types would. So the species and the early varieties, you'll find the bumblebees like to visit, and some varieties more than others. So yes, pollinators will go to them, but not perhaps as much as other plants. But then our bees are quite clever. They want to go to the easiest source to get as much from whatever they're gathering as easy as possible. So they are going to look for flowers with a higher pollen count and nectar count than perhaps the daffodil can offer.
I wonder if you'd noticed a trend for any particular varieties over the past years, or colours that have been more popular, or certain heights or certain flower types?
The colours are so diverse throughout the range, whether you look at the more modern daffodil that's been bred or you look at the species and the older varieties. Irrespective of what sort of thing you're looking for, you'll get a good colour range and you'll get the good scent. What I would say is over the last few years, there has been a bit of a revival in some of the historical varieties. They may not win the prizes on the show bench so much, but certainly in the gardens and the orchards, they look very natural and they're quite stunning. However, recently I have found that the modern daffodil, people are enjoying them purely because of the colour and the brightness and the scent. You put those in the pot on the doorstep and they certainly draw an eye. So it's a difficult one to answer. I think people's trends and ideas change from year to year and they like to have a go at something different. So I'll have to wait and see what this year brings.
Yeah, indeed. And you mentioned the tassiter ones for scent, and I guess this is a bit of a subjective question, but what ones are the best for scent in your opinion?
Well, there's many different varieties of daffodils, so they put them into different divisions, 1 to 13. Now, the main scented ones would be divisions 7 and 8, your jonquillas and your terzettas. And so to make that a little bit easier, they're your multi-headed daffodils. So they're multi-florited as they come up. They're all very, very scented. So if you're looking for scented ones, those are the ones, your jonquillas, terzettas. However, there are exceptions to the rules. So some of our later varieties, the poeticus daffodils, or the pheasant's eyes as people will know them, they can be very scented. And there's a few others that creep in there. One of my favourites, he's a great name, is Sir Winston Churchill. That's a very highly, sweetly scented daffodil. Not tobacco smoke, as you might think.
Good, glad to hear it. So if people are thinking of ordering daffodils, this episode is going to go out at the end of March sometime. When do they need to order? When do they need to plant? When do they need to be thinking about next year?
As far as ordering daffodils, I would recommend order as early as possible, especially if you want something a little bit specific. Some of these daffodils aren't growing en masse. They're small growers like ourselves that are trying to keep them and preserve them for the future. So once they're gone, they're gone. So order as early as possible. As far as planting goes, you're not going to get them until September, which is really when you should be looking at planting a daffodil, September, October time. So what I say is order now. When you receive them in September, that's when you should be planting the daffodils, ready for a display next year.
And so people might bump into you at some shows that are coming up, is that correct? Would that be a good thing to do, to visit an exhibitor at a show or to go and see a display of daffodils somewhere and then make a note of what you like and then, as you say, place your order?
Yeah, absolutely. There's various shows that go on throughout the country, be it a village show or an RHS show. So go along and have a look. There's always people there that will be willing to talk to you about daffodils and give you a little bit of advice, and you'll be made more than welcome. You could also look at the Daffodil Society. I'm sure they would give you all the help you need and put you in the right direction.
And if people want to look at your website, can you just let me know your website address?
The website, it's R.A. Scamp Quality Daffodils, and the website address is www.qualitydaffodils.com.
Yes, do go and check out Adrian's website. I've also posted a link to his catalogue in the show notes, so you can go and have a look and be tempted by all the beautiful daffodils they have to offer. It really is very good advice to plan your garden where possible. So if you have a chance, it's a great idea to have a look around now and identify any gaps in your planting or your containers, and to plan the bulbs that could fill those gaps next year. Much as it goes against my slapdash nature and compulsive purchasing habits, the best gardens are those with a sense of coherence, and this is achieved in large part by forward planning. So go round and make a note of which daffodils you really like the look of, identify areas where you can plant them, be bold and brave and order plenty rather than dotting a few here and there, and don't forget to get your order in before they sell out. A really big thank you to Adrian for sharing his knowledge, and thanks to you for listening. I'll catch you next Tuesday for a special bugcast when I'll be talking exotic plants and why you might want to panic buy plants before December comes around. Intrigued? You should be. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website www.rootsandall.co.uk, where you'll also find my blog and a sign-up form for the newsletter, which gives you a weekly roundup of content, plus the inside scoop on things like upcoming guests. Or you can subscribe wherever you normally get your podcasts. Email me with comments and feedback at podcast@rootsandall.co.uk. Follow me on Twitter, Roots and All, Facebook, Roots and All UK, and Instagram, Roots and All Pod. But please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support my work, because if you like what I do, please help me to continue doing it. Even if you make a one-off donation of £1, trust me, it all helps, and I will be immensely grateful. So please go to Patreon and search for Roots and All.